Excellent. Microphone working for everyone? Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'm going to assume that there are no problems online unless one of you shouts at me. So thank you so much to the organizers. I am so intimidated and honored and quite scared to be here. Um, to all of you attending, this is an absolutely stellar lineup. It's really difficult sometimes to get a view of this literature and what is quite a contested field in some spaces. And this day could not be a better program for introducing and advancing these discussions. So thank you so much. Very, very delighted to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about a couple of research projects that I've been working on, looking specifically at how introducing researcher voice into conversations around qualitative open research is really, really important if we're to guarantee uptake in the future of an inclusive open research. Okay. So hang on a minute. Okay. So I'm going to start off with, it would be a bit weird to do a presentation on researcher voice without inviting some audience participation. So hopefully this will work for both in person and online. I have a Mentimeter set up. So you can use the QR code or you can join at menti.com and then use that code. So I'm going to leave that up for a couple of minutes. Well, yeah, like 10 seconds. So final, final chance. And then I'll move across and you should still be able to see. Online folks, I'm hoping you can see what I'm doing. If not, please let me know. Oh, I need to move this. How do I move the bar without action? Ha! There we go. Okay, cool. We're getting there. We're getting there. All right. So you should be able to access. Oh my days. See, this is the thing. It's like, this is a big risk, introducing some technology when I'm not the most savvy. Okay, present. Are we there? Hey. Yay. Has everyone got access to that online? Yep. Okay, I'll move this around again. There's a touchpad here, so I am not used to that. Great. Okay, cool. So has everyone got access to the Menti? I'm assuming people online also have. I can kind of see the chat, so excellent. I'm getting nods in the front row. Awesome. So because I have the honor of opening this up, I wanted to start off with a little bit of sharing information about who you all are. So if you could let me know what your field or discipline is, you should have an option to that. There we go. Perfect. So I know we have lots and lots of different disciplines in the room. Okay, psychology is massive. Great. That's also quite consistent with a lot of open research conversations, which we'll potentially go into later. So we've got psychology, conversation analysis. That makes sense with Bogdana in the room. Social sciences, wow, okay, there is a lot here. Socio-hydrology. We got library information science, excellence. Librarians are the fundamentals of the university, so it's great to hear from you all. Sex research, book history, English lit, psychology, psychiatry, sorry, natural sciences, children's role models. Oh my gosh, okay. Theory, pedagogy, great. And you can keep adding to this as well. But what I just want to illustrate is that there's often an assumption in these discussions that we're all coming from the same perspective, and we aren't. There are lots and lots of different people involved in this conversation. And qualitative research is a very rich field. It's a very rich methodology that is relevant to lots and lots of different disciplines. So excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's move on to the next participation. Oh my. We'll get there. We'll get there. Okay. Now I'm also interested to hear about all of your career stages. So I'm obviously an assistant professor or a lecturer in the UK. Okay. A lot of professional support staff. That is awesome. Lots of PhDs. Great to see you all. Brilliant. Okay, some lecturers. There's actually a really great spread of career stages, which is awesome. I think sometimes when I run these kind of talks, it's a lot of PhD students and not many other kinds of researcher. So it's a really great spread. Okay, cool. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. But again, while we're having these conversations throughout the day, question your assumptions about who's in the room. Not necessarily everyone is a doctor, not necessarily everyone is an academic. Think about these things. Cool. Okay. Now, I want you all to reflect, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to reflect on this question. Because this is really, really crucial for the rest of the day. So what does openness and transparency mean to you? Science done right. Interesting. Okay, reporting honestly, rigor, sharing. Collaboration is great. I love that. Equity as well. Great. Someone's read the UNESCO report that I'm going to share. Honesty, accountability, an opportunity. Excellent. Being open to participations, collaborative approach, social justice. Yes. Accessibility. We've got replicable, reproducible there as well. For the positivists in the room. We'll get into that. Open access. Okay, great. Amazing. Okay, 108. Wow. Okay. So this is awesome. Again, I think there's often an assumption that openness means the same thing to everyone. And it typically is kind of translated as reproduction or replicability. And what this shows us is that even among this room, we have so many different understandings of what this means and what the priorities are for open research. So we're going to get to interrogate these a little bit more throughout the day, but just bear this in mind. I think this is really, really awesome and a great sign that you've managed to bring together a really diverse group. Okay. I think, yeah, okay, final audience participation before I get on to actually speaking like I was told to do. What do you hope to get from today? What do you hope to learn? This might be something that you need to kind of think about long term. You don't necessarily have to write it in now. I want to know where my people are. Yes. So do I. I think events like this are really, really important for bringing people together. And we'll talk a little bit about advocacy later on as well. There's a workshop on community building, which I am very excited about. Okay. So connect with like-minded people, perspectives from the community, new developments. Struggling. So let's just shift through perspectives from the community, new developments. Okay. Lots and lots. How to do it. Great. Okay, cool. I'm going to leave that up and then we can maybe come back to it towards the end of the day to see if we have actually learned the things we wanted to. Brilliant. Okay, so with that, you can relax. I'm not going to question you anymore until the end. Great. Okay. Thank you so much for engaging so wholeheartedly in that. I think it'll be really, really helpful for all of us who are speakers and also all the workshop leaders to have some additional context about what perspectives everyone is coming from. So the central questions for me when it comes to openness and transparency, and the questions I always get asked from my fellow qualitative scholars are, why do we care? Why do we care about this? Why should we bother? What will this add to our research? What will this add to our theorizing, to our communities? You might be thinking about openness and transparency in some of these areas. I think the answers I got were a little bit more diverse compared to the categories I came up with before this. You might be thinking about your data collection method, your analysis method. You might be thinking about openness in a research context. I know some of you here are from nonprofit studies as well. I think Pamela and Renee are in the room. So in terms of, yep, there we go. So in terms of that, thinking about how transparency can help societal outcomes is really important. It might be that openness is actually just really important to you and in terms of your values as a person. I always get really frustrated when I'm doing labor for someone else that is then put behind a paywall and I don't get credit for. So that's something that drives me. It's not necessarily something that's covered in the literature, but it is something that's important. And we can think about our values throughout this. So there are lots and lots of different reasons we should be thinking about openness and transparency. And there's a lot a lot of progress around openness and transparency. Lots of different measures and open research practices have been brought in to try and encourage openness and transparency in research. How many of you in the room, if you just put your hands up, sorry, online, you can do this kind of in your own time. Put your hands up if you're familiar with open data. Almost everyone in the room, great. Hands up if you're familiar with open materials. Hands up for pre-registration. Yep, okay, cool. Hands up for open access publication. Hands up for open access peer review. Okay, slightly fewer, but still, this is a talk in the Netherlands, I'm realizing, and you guys are really advanced when it comes to a lot of open science. Oftentimes when I talk to qualitative scholars, and I'll show some data on this later on, there is not this much familiarity with these measures. So I'm going to skip a bunch of my talk, which is great. So I mentioned the UNESCO recommendation on open science earlier. For those of you asking questions about why should you bother, what will this add to our research, I think this report is a really, really good starting point, because it talks about the kind of values surrounding openness and transparency and the sort of principles that openness and transparency can promote in our research. For things like quality and integrity, collective benefit, equity and fairness, diversity and inclusiveness. All of these things are actually not linked to particular epistemology, which I really, really like about this. It's not phrased in a kind of quantitative manner, as a lot of things are. And a lot of you will already be familiar with lots of the different changes, but if there is anyone watching that is not super familiar, I highly recommend you check out this paper, which was published by the Fort team in Nature Human Behavior, which is up there. And I did have a GIF kind of cycling through this massive glossary of lots and lots of different open science terms. So if you are ever confused about what something means, this is your resource. It is awesome. And I think we have some co-authors in the room. So thank you very much for making that for all of us. Cool. So when I started working in this area, something I would talk about is that there was a lot of progress on openness and transparency in quantitative methods, but the conversation in qualitative methods seemed to not be advancing as quickly, or it seemed to be a bit quiet. There wasn't a lot of conversation about it. And when I entered this sort of space, it was at SIPS in Rotterdam in 2018, actually. So if any of you were also at that meeting, that was where my journey started. So it's good to be back in the Netherlands. Since then, the field has grown a huge amount. I mean, the amount of interest in this event is a huge signal that people are talking about this. There is a lot of work on this. So I don't think it's the case that the work isn't being done. And also lots of people in the room have done excellent work on this. I tried to summarize some of it. And I actually got so overwhelmed that I just kind of gave up on this slide. So just check out everyone else's slides from today just to see how much work is being done. But where my research comes in is I think there's a lot of methodological conversations about this. There's a lot of really great scholarship, but I think that practical guidance when it comes to early career folks, PhD students, if someone is asking questions about what they should do, I think practical guidance is kind of falling down quite a lot. So one of the reasons I think this is because we conducted a content analysis of over 260 social psychological journals. And we looked at the kind of guidelines that researchers were provided when it comes to opening up their data. And this project kind of started out because I was so confused about what to do with my qualitative data, whether it was sensitive, whether it was okay to share it. I knew that there was a lot of discussion going on in quantitative methods saying that I should share data. I didn't know what to do. So I was hoping that by doing this kind of content analysis, by reviewing lots of different journals, I would find out what to do. That didn't happen. So we had like a really cool sort of like content analysis table where we were like, okay, are they going to talk about reflexivity? Are they going to talk about community and ethics? We didn't get to use any of that because most journals didn't even mention qualitative research in their open data guidelines at all. So I think out of the 260 odd journals that we looked at, only 4.5% mentioned qualitative research in their open data guidelines. So yeah, this was really depressing and quite frustrating. I mean, it was a good contribution for our paper to make to kind of point this out, but I think it really shed light on just how little guidance there was. And this wasn't in 2017 either. I think we did this content analysis in 2021. And things have changed a little bit, but there are still issues. Speaking of which, another paper that I worked on last year looked at one specific journal policy, which was in the Journal of Health Psychology, known as mandatory inclusion of raw data. Have any of you heard of this policy? Yes, okay. So for those of you who haven't, this kind of mandated sharing of raw data upon submission to the journal. So your journal couldn't even be reviewed unless you had the accompanying raw data. Now, for the quantitative folks in the room, that might seem completely fine and completely valid. That might be in accordance with a lot of the principles of open research and open science. For the qual folks, quite scary, not ideal. So we wrote this kind of position paper looking at this policy and exactly what the issues are for qualitative research. And we kind of came up with these three main issues, which we worded in a very tongue-in-cheek way because I was quite annoyed. So the first one is, would you like this data raw, medium, or well done? What does raw data mean? Are you talking about raw like video, audio, which you'll be able to discuss later today? Are you talking about identifiable transcripts? What are you talking about? Because we know based on the other research that you're not talking about qualitative methods at all. So where do we even start with this? The next thing was that people were really concerned about the participants and what these kind of things meant for participants, particularly in health psychology. My collaborator on this paper, Ralph Bagnall, works in autism and the criminal justice system, obviously deals with a lot of highly sensitive data as part of that. And the idea for him that he would just release that data without thinking, very, very bad, not good. And then the final section that I worked on is the idea of looking at what opening data in the present means for the future. And at the time that we wrote this, AI models and ChatGPT wasn't super widespread, but I did consider, like, if you're opening data, does that mean that people can reuse it? Does it mean that AI can reuse it? There are models that exist that help to identify people's information based on the sort of language that people use. You at the FOO probably know more about this than I do. But yeah, so this is an issue. So we have some guidance, but it's usually insufficient, irrelevant, or inappropriate, which is a big issue. So moving on to some empirical data. So my training was in psychological research and environmental social science. The job market is an interesting beast for mixed methods and interdisciplinary researchers. So by some small miracle, I guess, I managed to get a permanent job. And that job was in marketing, business, and society. And I'm still doing a lot of the same research that I did within psychology, but the kind of disciplinary baggage is very, very different. So given that I was an interdisciplinary scholar, I wanted to move into this new domain, looking at this open research debate and seeing how management scholars were looking at it. And what I found was a very different kind of landscape to psychology. In management, there is very much what I call editorial deadlock. So there's deadlock between two quite extreme positions on open qualitative research. The first one is kind of outright rejection. These are both really good papers. I'm not like, I think they both have really good valid points. The first paper talks about how openness is kind of equated with replication, and that's a really big issue for non-positivist research. So we have this kind of outright rejection, and then we also have a kind of uncritical acceptance, which doesn't really, in my opinion at least, look at the nuances between lots of different approaches. Editorials are really, really important in management and in lots of other disciplines, less so in psychology, I think, but you might have ideas about how your own discipline responds to these kind of issues. In management, conversation is mostly editorials, which is a big problem. And in management, it's really, really important that we start to reckon with these issues, because some of the most high profile cases of research fraud and lots and lots of different things are within management and organizational scholarship or within business schools. So some of you may be familiar with the Francesca Gino case. She's based at Harvard Business School, was accused, and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that she did. Fraudulently create a lot of data. There's lots and lots of issues around management scholarship. And these editorials and journals play vital roles, but it's actually unclear what researchers think. A lot of the conversation is at such a top level that we don't actually know how researchers like ourselves in the room, especially early career folks, how are we responding to these? How are we seeking information? What do we think about these issues? Do we align with these kind of extreme positions? So this was what our project aimed to explore. We wanted to get an understanding of how much researcher voice could help us kind of move beyond this dichotomy of acceptance and rejection. So we did a mixed method survey of management and organizational scholars. And I'm going to very quickly run through some of these findings. So the first thing that we found in the survey is that awareness of open research practices within this community of qualitative organizational and management scholars was actually a lot lower than we anticipated. So most people would, no, actually, you look at the figures. So these are the percentages of our participants who had heard of different things. So the most popular open research practice that people had heard of was providing their anonymized data. And even then, only 53% of our sample had actually heard of doing this, right? Not great. People hadn't really heard of providing reflexivity statements. They had not heard of author credit statements, which I was really surprised about. Yeah, so that was fun. But also people weren't using these kind of practices, and they also didn't really want to use them in the future. And when they did in their free responses talk about openness and transparency, they largely talked about it in relation to raw data sharing, as a lot of the literature also does. And they also discussed pursuing openness and transparency within the bounds of the methods section of the journal article, rather than outside. And the open science practices that we most commonly talk about in the quantitative space were actually seen as kind of irrelevant and not even that important to qual folks. So whereas a lot of people had heard of sharing open data, sharing raw data was actually the least important. And sharing their research outside of academia was seen as the most. So overall, we found that qualitative researchers have really mixed feelings about open research, and they don't really see this kind of dichotomy of rejection and acceptance. It's actually a lot more nuanced than that. People have concerns about it, but they also see really good opportunities. So I'm going to go a little bit more into the first two, but just to touch on the third and fourth theme here. So people were concerned about the lack of incentives for open research. They were concerned about the amount of time it took to open their research. They were concerned, particularly in management, where review processes can take 3 to 5 years to get through, which surprised me as a psychologist. You can go through 5 rounds of peer review in management and still get rejected at that point, by the way. So again, peer review practices are not the same in entered. So when you've got a peer review system that looks like that, if you're sharing your research openly before it's even published, that could be a potential issue. But they did see kind of opportunities for open research in terms of widening access to data, helping people learn about the processes of qualitative research, and also increasing the dissemination and the transparency, rigor, and trustworthiness work. So let's go a little bit more into the first two. Hey. I've got about 5 minutes. So one of the qualitative findings is that when open research was seen as sharing data, which it was seen as sharing data primarily to a lot of people, participants reject this based on ethical. So I do mixed methods and primarily qualitative work. I wanted to share some quotes here. So one participant said, "It is already difficult to gain informants' trust, and this is compounded if you were to tell people their comments, behaviors, etc., are going to be publicly available for scrutiny." So this sample were really, really concerned about their relationships with their respondents, with their communities. Some organizational scholars spend years developing trust with a company so they can go in and do their research. And they felt that adhering to open research would actually produce some of that trust. Worth saying here that I'm not really going to comment on whether I think these things are true. These are what people are saying and what they understand and what they think. Scholars were also concerned about risks of privacy breaches, disclosing identity. So there's a workshop on de-identification, which would be helpful for some of these concerns. And they were also concerned about the potential legality of sharing particular data. And this echoes some concerns that I have about openness in research and changing political and economic climates. I mean, all of you who are based in the Netherlands will have experience with a tough changing political climate. Those of you zooming in from the US and other places will also see this. Sometimes the political climate in which we open our research is not the same over time, and that can change how our research is used, interpreted. There was some worry that open data in particular would be used to kind of prosecute individuals. So these are very real concerns that people have that are grounded in ethics, okay? So we're talking about ethics. Right. There was also a lot of talk about how open science was kind of seen as incompatible with non-positivist research. So our participants told us that open science is often presented through organizing principles and values that are rooted in quantitative positivism. So they were talking about things like fraud, observable truths, being open research is only relevant for replication, being concerned about the label of science. The label of science is really alienating for a lot of researchers in this space. So I would really caution, I would really caution using the term open science instead of open research. We can maybe discuss that later. And they felt that their research was, and their data was being decontextualized. So to shed light on some of this, I think that there is something that doesn't make sense in wanting to apply quantitative research trends to qualitative methods. Again, one for Tamarind, who is in the room somewhere. This quote, "Pre-registration involves hypothesis testing. Qualitative methods are not intended to predict. It is a journey of discovery. It is messy. For this reason, I do not believe that pre-registration is consistent with a qualitative." There were lots of these kind of quite, almost aggressive and reactionary comments of just like, no, these things aren't appropriate for us. When I was talking to some of my colleagues about this project, I even had some of this reactance against me personally. So I organized a qualitative open research event like this, and some of my fellow qualitative scholars in management were like, yeah, it's interesting you're doing that. Why aren't you doing it for quant folks? What are you trying to say to qualitative people? We already do this. Like, okay. I wasn't saying anything, but fine. So, okay, we reject it based on epistemological grounds. That was the point that I was going to make during that. So some of you, I think, in the room attended this event. It was kind of similar to this, but the difference is that we run an event, a symposium every year that is solely for qualitative researchers. And this year, the theme was openness, transparency, and rigor. So it attracted a wide crowd, and what we saw from this the presentations and the conversations, there has been a lot of progress in infrastructure. There's been a lot of progression in the debates around open research, but there is still, among a lot of interdisciplinary qual folks, concern for the impact of openness on marginalized, vulnerable populations, and there's also still very much a lack of guidance. And if any of you are interested in networking with more qualitative folks, we run this symposium every year on slightly different themes, so find us on social media. Okay, so coming to the end, I think I'm going to go slightly over if that's all right. Sorry about that, the Menti took a bit longer, but I think it was worth it. Okay, So thinking about some lessons for open researchers, I'm now in marketing, so I feel qualified to say that open science has a branding issue. I think, why are we calling it open science when we're referring to qualitative research? We need to be very specific in our language. We also need to think about the impact that our language has on researchers and populations we hope to engage. Open science may be very strategic and useful for quantitative positivists, but for qualitative interpretivist scholars, it can be really alienating. And changes enforced from outside of the knowledge of fields, methods, and disciplines will probably be rejected from scholars within those fields. And I think this is a particular lesson for psychologists, because we have made a lot of progress within our field, and there is, I think, sometimes a tendency to assume that other fields should just copy and paste what we have done. That's bad. We need to ensure that if we are encouraging other fields, disciplines, and methods to change, we understand the kind of context within those fields. We take the time to engage those scholars. That is really important if we are to affect any change. We need to stop focusing on reproducibility in science when it comes to qualitative research. I think Nikki might have things to do. These are interesting debates that we can have in the methodological literature, but when it comes to sort of researchers working on the ground, these things are alienating. They're not necessarily a good first port of call for these things. But there are other things that are a lot easier to engage people with. Most of the people we spoke to were really supportive of open access publishing. And they were rightfully angry that their research was kind of being. That's an aspect of open science and open research that we can use to appeal to broader audiences. And I told you we were going to get to the positivism side of things. I think we do frame this debate, and we dominate this debate with kind of positivist logics that aren't necessarily inclusive of qualitative research. So if we're talking about things like reproducibility, broad, the idea that science is inherently scarce and competitive, that is a quantitative positivist idea. If we're talking about the need to express objectivity, these are all quantitative positivist things. And we need a sort of better awareness of our own positionality and epistemology to communicate this. And I was trying to, in a paper that I'm working on that is quite challenging to work on, think about what we can translate these logics from to appeal more to qualitative sensibilities. Some of these might be up for debate. I mentioned transferability at a recent event, and the entire subsequent discussion was around how that was inappropriate. So yes, these things are under development. There is a lot of baggage around terms, and we need to engage with that baggage and work out what is best to do. But I think a lot of us can already identify with things like collegiality, creating a culture of abundance, making sure that our work is accessible to those who want to benefit from it. I think we can see open research as a way to emphasize our subjectivity as well, and to emphasize the amount of work we already do to ensure ethics. There's a lot of qualitative research that is kind of sanitized and silenced when we publish journal articles. We can take the space for open methods and use it to showcase the work that we are already doing. This is something that we can also reject this kind of positivist idea of black and white thinking. So I also look at this in climate behavior. There's a tendency among us to think that things are really good or things are really bad and there's no in between. There is an in between, and we should be thinking about it. So if we can't completely open our data, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have everything inaccessible. What is the space in between? Fast forward. We can come back to some of this stuff in the discussion. Okay. I also think that we should value openness as process instead of a practice, thinking about the entire research program. And we really, really need to raise researcher voice around these issues. There are a couple of really great examples of engaging researchers. I am going over time, and I want to leave some space for discussions. So I'm going to kind of conclude with some of these points that this conversation is for everyone. It's not just for academics. It's not just for editors. It is for all of us in the room to take part in. So what can we do to move forward? We can reconsider our use of language. We can avoid invoking these positivist logics. reject this idea of black and white thinking, move on to something a little bit more nuanced. We can value openness as a process, not just a single practice. And we can also recognize, support, and celebrate those people who are already doing the work. I think this event is a really good example of how we can build community and voice around these topics. So I got there in just under 35. So thank you very much, everyone. Time for questions.